Dear students, welcome to my channel Dr. Anju Gurawa. Now today we are going to discuss Sir Philip Sidney, An Apology for Poetry. This is actually a text which is in your syllabus and it is in semester 2. The text which is prescribed for your syllabus is Philip Sidney, An Apology for Poetry, edited by Forrest G. Robinson, Macmillan, 1985. This is the text which you need to discuss, because there will be many texts on apology for poetry. This has been edited by many. Primarily the text is written by Philip Sidney, but many people might have given their interpretation. N number of things are there. So we are going to discuss only which is prescribed for the syllabus. Now let me come to, I'm Dr. Anju Gurawa. I'm a faculty in Department of English, University of Delhi. So, and I'm actually teaching this text also. So you just see, let's have the interpretation. My concern here would be mostly, I'll try to give you explanation, but basically the text is before you. You can read and draw your own interpretation as well. So you don't depend that every single line I'll explain. My concern would be those who are significant points, which are significant point, I'll try to do. So at least you can remember those facts for your exam. So let's start. And this is what I have to use, a light color. So An Apology for Poetry or Defense of Poesy is a work of literary criticism written by Elizabethan poet Philip Sidney around 1580 and published posthumously 1595. Posthumously means just after his death. It is believed that Sidney was partly motivated by Stephen Gosson, a former playwright who criticized poetry in 1579 work The School of Abuse. But Sidney primarily addresses broader objection to poetry, particularly those made by Plato. Sidney argues that poetry by blending the liveliness of history with the ethical focus of philosophy is more effective than either in inspiring virtue. He defends poetry as an art of imitation designed to teach and delight, emphasizing that its value lies in what is communicated. Sidney contends that even history, when presented in a passionate and vivid manner, becomes poetic. See, there are students in our department, those many times they prefer Hindi understanding also. So I'll try to make certain facts, but I think it's easy to understand you. I'll explain things. So this Apology for Poetry, or you can say the Defense of Poesy, is written by Philip Sidney. He was known as Elizabethan poet, and his time period is primarily 1580. So this work, you know, how did this came in existence? Basically what happened in 1579, one writer was there. He was a playwright, Stephen Gosson. Okay, you see this Stephen Gosson is there. So this Stephen Gosson wrote something about poetry, and that was, this Stephen Gosson was there and he wrote something about poetry. And what is this? This was, his work was School of Abuse, in which he is actually putting a lot of arguments against poetry, blending the liveliness of history with ethical focus of philosophy. So his concern is that other subject, history and philosophy, is better than poetry, and that's what he is giving an argument, that Plato was against poetry, because somewhere Plato, he is discussing about the banishment of poets from the state. So this is main reason that Stephen Gosson in the School of Abuse in 1579 wrote many arguments against poetry, and that Philip Sidney thought of replying it. So it's a kind of argument and counter argument. So what are these counter arguments? Let's understand. Now he prefers imaginative literature because it offers more moral instruction in the philosophy and history, which merely depict the real world without realizing it. Sidney respond to the several charges made by Gosson. So this is an argument and counter argument. So what are the counter arguments is making? That poetry is a waste of time. So Gosson said poetry is a waste of time, because in further I will discuss that how Gosson, what are the points Gosson is making. So let me just come to first what are the points Gosson is making. He is arguing certain points, these are the points made by Gosson. This is what, from here I will start. So poetry is a waste of time. This is what Gosson charged in his abuse of, what is this? The title is The School of Abuse. In this School of Abuse, is writing that poetry is a mother of lie. This is the second argument. Then poetry is the nurse of abuse. Then fourth is Plato was right to banish poems from his ideal world. So when Plato is talking about this ideal state, he is demanding one thing, that poet must be banished, because they go for imaginative things, and somewhere he is making poets for the charges. He is charging poets against that false claims, because they hyper things and imagination is there, so it is nowhere related to the reality of the life. So that's how this argument is there. So what is this then? A source of lie, promoter of abuse, and Plato was right to banish. These are the 4 points basically. You can simply say, okay, these are the 4 points basically if you say, and that's what, on the basis of these 4 points, Gosson is making his argument. In defense, Sidney asserts that poetry is not a waste of time and a valuable source of knowledge, a civilization for teachers, virtue, and while entertaining. Argues poets do not lie, and they never claim their work are factual, and the truth in poetry are ideal and universal. He rejects the claim that poetry promotes abuse, stating that in human misuse, not poetry itself fosters immoral behavior. On the contrary, poetry helps to maintain morality and peace, avoid violence and bloodshed. So these are the, in half of this para you will see the arguments given by Stephen Gosson. These are arguments, and rest of the counter arguments given by Sidney. So this line, this paragraph is also significant. You can basically see this. Okay, so then let's move on. Now I'll be using different color codes, so this will help you. Now Sidney also clarifies that Plato's objection to poetry in Republic was not blanket ban on all the poets, but only those whose works were inadequate for instructing the youth. Sidney views art as a creative imitation of nature, not a slavish copy as Plato suggests. He believes that nature, often dull and imperfect, is transformed by the art's imagination into something more beautiful and ideal. Sidney also championed poetic justice, where good characters are rewarded and wickets are punished, asserting that poetry teaches virtue better than moral philosophy or history, because this was one of the arguments from Plato, because Plato suggested more, he put more value to, Plato is suggesting more value to history and philosophy. These two subjects are being given more prominent value by Plato. So this argument is going against poetry, but anyway we are counter arguing, which are both limited in their approach. So here Sidney is making another point that primarily history and philosophy, they are limited in approach, but poetry has unlimited access to human imagination, human inspiration. So provide a blend of abstract concrete example that inspire moral behavior, and such hold superior position in both philosophy and history, because this is one of the argument given by Plato, that it creates immorality. Poetry creates immorality. That's why Sidney is giving counter argument, and he says that it creates moral behavior. This is one of the basic reason that it creates moral behavior. So these are the points you have to remember. Otherwise, everybody is writing a story, so please don't write a story in your answer. Now let's come to this next point. Okay, so then an apology for poetry or defense of poesy is a literary criticism, a work by Elizabethan poet Philip Sidney, written around actually these are the points, these are the pointers. So sometime you will realize that these pointers are having repetition. So repetition is good for you because you can remember that, revise that. So that's why we are going for the repetition, but pointers as well. 1580, and the first published in 1595 after Sidney's death. As Sidney was partially motivated by Stephen Gosson, a former playwright who attacked poetry in the School of Abuse 1579. Sidney also responded to general objection to poetry, particularly those by Plato. The work integrates classical and Italian percept on fiction. Sidney's central argument is poetry is more effective than history or philosophy in promoting virtue, as it combines the liveliness of history with ethical focus of philosophy. The essay offers comment on Edmund Spenser and Elizabethan stage. So that's how we here go for this. So basically history and philosophy are being put in one box, and which is equal to poetry. So that's how the argument is going in this way. Sidney's view on poetry. What Sidney says about poetry. Poetry is an art of imitation for a specific purpose, to teach and delight. It is a superior means of communication, and its values depends on the message conveyed. Imaginative literature like poetry teaches better than history or philosophy. Poetry has the power to reproduce an ideal world, not just the imperfect real world. Stephen Gosson's charges against poetry. So that's, I already read out what Stephen Gosson is saying. Poetry is a waste of time. Poetry is the mother of lies. Poetry is the nurse of abuse. Plato was right to banish poets from his ideal world. Now Sidney's response to Gosson's charges, and that's what I told you. It might be repetition, but good for you. Poetry is a source of knowledge and civilizing forces. Sidney argues that no learning is as effective as poetry in teaching and motivating virtues. One more scientific argument we can give here. Poetry appeals to the imagination of, imaginative part of mind. Whatever that physical or the other structure of brain is there. So that physical structure of imagination is being most often inspired or touched by poetry. And that's why, and this is one of the most strong aspect of human brain. And that is why it is always appealing. Poetry is always appealing because it is somewhere rhythmical, it is musical, it gives mind to expand, imagine things. You are speaking one line and then readers are interpreting in their own way. So it gives you a personal liberty as well. You can actually interpret things in your own way. So that is why instead of that a linear and a straight approach to knowledge, poetry gives a lot of deviation. So that is why it is one of the significant aspects. That's why children, everything, in children, it starts with poetry. When small children are there, it's only rhymes. We do not teach them paragraph or novel or prose or some essay competition. We don't go take children, those who are very small, maybe 1 year, 2 year. So they just listen words, they sing, and that it appeal. So it's a music, it's a rhythm, it is somewhere a small sentences. That is why poetry is significant. Poetry can teach, these were the language, diction aspect I was talking, but that is equally appealing to the human brain as well. Poetry can teach and amuse better than history or philosophy. In Sidney's time, poetry was main source of education in societies. He references ancient Greek society which respect poets. Poets should be revered, making poetry not a waste of time. And one more thing, if you see, even if when we see how this literature started, how this process of writing in a human life started. So initially when people are writing, they didn't start writing lengthy text, for example, but everything started with poetry. Even if the literature also, English literature also, you see, beginning is always a poetry. After that it comes with the other form of writing, for example fiction or prose or any other form of writing, but primarily everything starts with poetry. That's why we have poets in the beginning. So Sidney's answer to the charges of lying is poetry does not lie because poets never claim their fictional work as true. That's what very strong argument. So poetic truth are ideal and universal, so poetry cannot be mother of lies. And Sidney's response to poetry as a source of abuse. Sidney rejects the idea that poetry is a source of abuse. It is people who misuse poetry. People, philosophy and history are more likely to nurse abuse with their portrayal of battle, bloodshed and violence. Poetry helps maintain morality and peace, avoiding violence and promoting knowledge. Now, Sidney's view on Plato's attack on poetry. So, what are the argument given by Plato and what are the counter argument given by Sidney? Let's go here. Plato's Republic aimed to banish the abuse of poetry, not poets themselves. So, when Plato is talking about to banish poetry, he is not actually banishing poets, but those poets who are claiming false. And poets are never claiming that their knowledge is real. They already say that this is it is based on fictional truth, claim their fictional work, and they don't never claim that it is truth. Then Plato never called for banishment of all poets, only those who are inferior and cannot properly instruct children. Plato himself was influenced by poetry as seen in his dialogues. In fact, many people say that Plato's writing is also poetical, it's also rhythmical. Then Sidney's concept of art. Plato's Republic itself is having a lot of musical aspects. So musical in the sense, the language, I am talking about the language. Art is creative imagination of nature, not slavish imitation as Plato suggested. Nature is seen as dull, incomplete and ugly, while artistic transformation it into something more beautiful and a golden color. Art is speaking picture that has a spatio-temporal dimensions. While Aristotle focus on human action, Sidney emphasizes emphasize nature in art. So these are the arguments. You can come back again to this video and again you can note down the points. Then artists must create work considering the audience level. The primary goal of art is to teach in dialogue, reflecting Renaissance ideal. Sidney's defense of poetic justice. In poetry, good characters are rewarded and evil characters are punished, reflecting poetic justice. But this never happened in many often it doesn't happen in history, because history present things in a more objective way. The way any war is there, whether it is good for humans or whether it is good for resources or waste of human life, waste of resources, waste of time even. But war is a war. So history project things the way it is, whether good or bad. But poetry gives you a kind of understanding to your mind that this is good, this is bad. So that's how we are. I think the poets are moralizing society much better. If the things are projected in a way, then it is left to the people that how do they interpret, and maybe children could misinterpret it. If we are projecting a lot of violence in the minds of children, then they think this is okay, it's fine. And that's why the abuse with the women. If any family which is having a frequent culture of beating their women in the house, then the children grow with the mindset that beating a woman is okay, because it's a part of life. Nobody said them this is wrong, and they do the same behavior. So that's why history sometimes reflect things in an objective way, and if it is not being given proper instruction to the children and the community that yes, this is wrong, this is right, otherwise people will take it the way, and then maybe the culture of violence become the part of society. So that's how. But poet always tell this is right, this is wrong. So that's how it is. It's a huge responsibility of poets to make society more better, more peaceful. Sidney's view on virtue. Plato's philosophy on virtue is ineffective in real world situation. That is battlefield. Poetry teaches virtue through both abstract and concrete example, blending the two. Then unlike philosophy and history, poetry presents idealized, inspiring examples which make it superior in teaching virtue. For example, when we are teaching history, most often it is being interpreted by the teachers that when Ashoka, he renounced the warfare, after Kalinga war, he renounced war. He said that I will never go for war because he saw a lot of bloodshed and waste of human life. So I think every teacher who is coming in the class, they appreciate this. The main concern behind this is to make our children feel and decide that war is not good for society, war is not good for community, war is not good for this whole universe, and war is not good for any human, individual or animal, or any living being, even the whole universe. It means this complete life. So that's how we have to interpret it. Putting things in a much objective way could lead to wrong interpretation. In poetry, ideal world heroes are depicted as virtuous and evils are corrupt. The didactic effect of poetry depends on the poet's ability to move and inspire the reader through the effective quality of the poem. Sidney on the form of poetry. Among the virtuous form of poetry, lyric, elegy, satire, comedy, epic is the most significant. Epic poetry portrays history, historic deed, heroic deed, inspiring courage and patriotism. Sidney's conclusion. So what is conclusion? Sidney's poetry. Sidney defends poetry's universal and timeless quality, making it a universal genius that transcends other form of knowledge and education. About Sir Philip Sidney, what is that? These are the factual informations. So what is this factual information? He was born on 30th November 1554 at Pensard Place, Kent. A poet, courtier, scholar, soldier, one of the prominent figure of Elizabethan age. His work, actually I have one more video on his personal life, so if you could go to my channel and you could see that we are talking, it's an exclusive video. You will find how his life was there and how he had a little there during this Queen Elizabeth, there were a lot of conflict between his family, clan and queen. So basically he was not given the place which he deserved as per his background. But these are the things which you can actually go and see my previous video. The defense of poesy, also known as the defense of poetry and apology for poetry. The Countess of Pembroke's Arcadia, Sidney came from an aristocratic family educated at Shrewsbury and Christ Church, Oxford. His father was Sir Henry Sidney and his mother was Lady Mary Dudley, daughter of John Dudley, 1st Duke of Northumberland. His younger brother Robert Sidney became a statesman and patron of the art. Sidney's finest literary achievement is his sequence of 108 love sonnets written to his mistress Lady Penelope Rich. He was influenced by Petrarch and Ronsard and is considered one of the greatest Elizabethan sonneteer after Shakespeare. Sidney's pastoral romance, The Arcadia, 1598, is an intricate love story that reflects medieval chivalric ideals. He had literary contact with Edmund Spenser, Fulk Greville, Edward Dyer and Gabriel Harvey as part of Areopagus, a humanist group seeking to classicize English verse. Critical points of Sidney's an apology for poetry. These are poet's place among the art is highest. So Sidney defends poetry as the highest form of art, claiming it precedes philosophy and history. He argues that many philosophers and historians like Plato and Herodotus borrow from poetry, making it foundational for these disciplines. Poetry is a creative art with the power to shape new, more perfect realities through the poet's imagination. Sidney portrays poets as seers or makers capable of conveying moral and philosophical truth through compelling narratives. So poetry as a teacher of virtue. And what is this? Sidney's emphasized that poetry teaches virtue more effectively than philosophy of history, while philosophy is abstract and history is limited to the real events. That's what objectification of events. Poetry combines both offerings, ideal examples of virtue through its engaging narratives. Through example of virtuous behavior, poet can inspire their readers to act morally, much like medicine curse the body. This moral education is virtual, is vital to society, making poet the right popular philosopher. So you can quote actually the right popular philosopher. That is by Sidney. Criticism of poetry is, Sidney addresses 4 key criticism of poetry. That is, poetry as a waste of time. He argues that poetry moves people to virtuous action, making it highly valuable. Poets as liars. Sidney contends that poets do not claim truth as philosophers or historians do. They create hypothetical, imaginative world and teach moral lessons. Poetry corrupts morals. He rejects the idea that explaining that bad poetry is misused by the people, but well-crafted poetry help preserve and promote virtues. Plato's criticism of poetry. Sidney refutes Plato's banishment of poets, as arguing by Plato was the only concern with inferior poets, not the entire art. So basically, this is what these 4 points, you can simply see what are the points made by Stephen Gosson, and then how these are the counter argued. So you can simply see poetry is a waste of time, the counter argument is given. Poet as liars, a counter argument given. Poetry corrupts morals, that a counter argument is given, and Plato's criticism of poetry. So this counter argument is given. You will find that things are repeating sometime, but that is fine, that's good for you. Okay, so poetry as role in society. What is this? Sidney defends the nobility of poetry, asserting that it has the power to move people to virtuous action. He also sees poetry as an essential for maintaining a society, culture and moral fabric. He critiqued the state of English poetry, pointing out its lack of quality, not due to the English language itself, but due to the poet's failure to follow classical tradition and lack of proper education. Sidney's use of rhetoric is what? Sidney's structure is defense like a judicial oration using classical rhetorical method, exordium, proposition, refutation and peroration. The structure helps him build a strong reason case of poetry. He uses for metaphor, particularly those horse riding analogy, convey the transformative power of poetry and its ability to shape character and minds. Sidney employs classical references including Horace and counters the rising disdain of poetry with his philosophical and moral argument. So defense of poetry, poetry's truth. Sidney argued that poetry does not deceive or lie, instead it creates a world of possibility that is no less true than history or philosophy. This allows poetry to offer alternative realities, teaching lessons that apply to life in general rather than specific historical truths. So censorship and the status of poets. What is this in the last? Sidney's dual role as poet and soldier. Sidney, because he was a soldier also. Sidney's personal identity as both as poet and soldier is the key to his argument. He links the virtue of poetry to the ideals of the courage and heroism, demonstrating that poetry is not just a refined or effeminate pursuit, but noble one that stirs people to action. So what is his conclusion? The immortality of poetry. Sidney concludes that by warning, poetry has the power to immortalize people through verses, but also condemn them to obscurity. He argues critics to take the argument seriously and then influence the legacy of writers and their societal importance, because he himself was a soldier, so he knew the value of war and poetry. Because why did I say value of war? Because by this Elizabethan time, escaping war is not possible. So that's how he was a soldier as well as a poet. So he could understand, because he is representing history and he is creating poetry. When he is a soldier, that time he's representing history, because he is encountering with the facts, but at the same time he is creating poetry. So he is trying to moralize the mind of the society. War doesn't moralize the mind of the society, but poetry moralize the society. Sidney, An Apology for Poetry is a foundational text in English literary criticism, defending the value, the importance of imaginative literature. His views on the ethical function of poetry, its role in society, and ability to teach virtue has a lasting impact of Renaissance through later literary theory. In essence, Sidney's work is a passionate defense of poetry, its moral and educational potential, ability to transcend mere fiction to inspire virtuous action, while also tackling the contemporary criticism of art, of the art form. So here we end. Thank you so much for being so much patient. You come to this text again, read it, and if you could read it loud, okay, it will definitely help you, and share with your friends. Even you can share it with your juniors so they can get it, because these are the basic points which is the argument is standing. After that you have many more other readings as well, you can follow that. So come to the channel, read it again, and write question sometime, that what is the perspective which from your point of view maybe we can discuss in a different way. So that's what my concern is here. Thank you so much, and God bless you. Share, like and subscribe the channel.